The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
So thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was here a few years ago to discuss the peace process with the Palestinians that I was involved in between 1999 and 2001. During my service in the government, I was privileged to work in the Bureau of the Prime Minister of Israel, and I experienced firsthand the weakness of the government when it came to dealing with the big issues that are facing our society. And what I saw was a mismatch between the complexity of the challenges that we face and the weakness of our political institutions. So I decided to create a group that will specialize in dealing with the emerging challenges that face Israel and the Jewish people, and will also serve our mission of Tikkun Olam, of building a model society in Israel and doing good in humanity. And so basically Reut today is, to put it in simple American terms, we're like a small-scale Israeli hybrid between Bell Labs and the RAND Corporation, which means we have very strong in-house research, strategy, and analysis capabilities, but we also have an in-house design and technology branch. So every problem we look at, we come with the analytical capabilities and with design and technology capabilities. And that's quite unique. Actually, I don't know of any similar activity in America. Actually, the only groups that have similar models in America are large corporations that have an in-house research group and design and technology groups. But basically, in the not-for-profit world, it doesn't exist. I was born and raised in Israel, served in the Navy as a captain, major, finished my service in 1995, joined a group that was dealing with the peace process. And during that period, from 95 to 99, I worked for a non-governmental group that did research and analysis and policy planning with regard to the Israeli Palestinian, Jordanian peace process and relations. Because of that work, when Ehud Barak was elected to be the Prime Minister of Israel, I was asked to join the Bureau of the Prime Minister and become part of the negotiation team as the secretary of the team. So from July 1999 to March 2001, I had a seat at the table, if you wish. I was the coordinator of the Israeli delegation in the period that led up to the Camp David summit. I was the youngest participant in the Camp David summit of 2000 that President Clinton brought together Israelis and Palestinians to resolve the historical conflict. I was centrally integrated into the process that followed the Camp David summit, leading up to the eruption of the Palestinian uprising on September 28, 2000, and then through that conflict with the Palestinians until Ehud Barak finished his tenure. So that was my history, and then I got the fellowship to go to the Kennedy School of Government, spent a year there digesting my experiences, and this is when I realized that that mismatch existed between what the government needed to do and the government was doing, and therefore I came up with the idea of establishing the Reut Institute. And Reut in Hebrew means the ability to see clearly. So basically we are a research, strategy, and leadership group dedicated to dealing with the issues that are crucial for the sustainable prosperity and security of the State of Israel and the Jewish people, and for making a significant and distinctly Jewish and Israeli contribution to humanity. I am very hesitant to say that something went wrong in Camp David. What actually happened in Camp David is that we had all found out that Yasser Arafat was not willing to sign a comprehensive peace agreement with Israel. So that was that was the reality that was exposed in Camp David. I wouldn't say it's something going wrong, but the world thought that Israel was responsible for not having a peace treaty. Those of the viewers that remember 1999 and 2000, it was Israel was repeatedly blamed for being unwilling to pursue the peace process following the 1996 to 1999 Netanyahu government. And Ehud Barak, the prime minister, was suspicious that actually Arafat was playing as if he wanted a deal, but in fact he didn't want a deal. And in fact, Arafat did whatever he could to avoid the Camp David summit. So basically, when we came to Camp David, Ehud Barak needed, his mindset as prime minister was either get an agreement, a historical agreement, or prove to the world that it's not Israel's fault that there is no agreement. So I would not say that something went wrong. It happened as planned. And the plan that Ehud Barak had two possible scenarios, an agreement or no agreement. And we ended up going down the track of no agreement. You've been to the house of Arafat in Gaza, because what was the mural on his wall? The big mural on Arafat's wall that stretched from one side of the room to the other side of the room was his version or vision of the history of Palestine, where the Jews and the Crusaders were the same, temporary on the land, and his vision was that eventually the Jews will go in the same way that the Crusaders disappeared. So Arafat was willing, in my view, to sign a long-term interim agreement, but not an agreement of peace and reconciliation where he recognizes the right of Jews for self-determination in what he called Palestine, what we call the land of Israel. So that's what he wasn't willing to do, and this is what was exposed in Camp David. And also later on, until the Palestinian response to the Clinton ideas in January 2001. So it was like a 6 month period of huge drama in the Middle East, where some of our ideas about what was possible between Israelis and Palestinians were proven wrong. And that's the reality we needed to live with ever since. This is why, for example, myself and our team, since very early on, endorsed the approach of Israeli unilateralism, because we believed that it is essential for Israel to end the control over the Palestinian population, but that we could not achieve that goal of not controlling the Palestinians through a process of negotiations and agreements. And this is why we actually supported unilateralism, and we have been supporting Israeli unilateralism since January 2006, but even earlier. The initial step that must be taken is for Israel to recognize the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank as a state, and then to negotiate state to state, Israel and Palestine in the West Bank, the outstanding issues between the two entities. First and foremost security, but then also economics and water and borders and so on. Because today Israel negotiates with the PLO. And the PLO represents the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon. So it's a very complicated organization. Whereas if you recognize the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that represents the people of the West Bank and the territory of the West Bank, and you engage them on the issues of the West Bank, then there is a much more coherent system that allows to achieve agreements. My point is, if Bougie Herzog would have been prime minister right now, he too would negotiate with the PLO. So in my view, this actually represents that all of them have an irrelevant mindset. And the necessary realignment that has to happen is recognize the Palestinian Authority as a state and deal with that state on a state-to-state basis. And that would be a much more effective way to create political progress. Unfortunately, also the Americans in Washington don't get it. And if you look at the way in which John Kerry dove headfirst into the empty pool of negotiations with 17 trips and 0 achievements to show for, it's because they came with the wrong mindset. That Israel and the Palestinians, the PLO, need to negotiate a comprehensive agreement on permanent status. John Kerry could have had much more fruitful effort if he would have helped the parties reach mutual recognitions, and then work the outstanding issues between the two states. You know, on the issue of a good negotiator, people believe in the power of the negotiators, and indeed negotiators play a crucial role. But in my experience, I would say that the prospects of successful negotiations are actually defined outside of the negotiation table. So if you have the right mindset about the negotiations, if you understand the basic parameters of the deal, you may end up bargaining successfully for a deal. But in the case of Kerry, they negotiated an impossible deal. He could have been the most amazing negotiator in the world. He was still pursuing a fata morgana. There was no agreement for him to achieve. Well, I think that the formative decisions by the Obama administration about the negotiations with Iran were two. First of all, they took off the table the military option. So there was no real threat or leverage on Iran. And the second thing that they did is that they narrowed the agenda of the negotiations exclusively to the nuclear project, which is a technical challenge of managing it. And again, they neglected or they refused, and again, they decided not to deal with the very aggressive policies of Iran around the world, in the Middle East, against Israel, against America, and so on. When you put those two things together, this is a recipe for an agreement that I think we will all live to regret. I think that what happens in this agreement is that Iran, who is a very aggressive and violent global power, repeatedly exercising force and using force to disrupt other countries in Africa, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in other locations, having carried military activities in Latin America, in Europe. So Iran is a force of evil and destruction when it comes to Israel and to the United States of America. And what this agreement does is it puts wind in its sails. Eventually, Iran will be a brink nation in terms of nuclear power, but more than that, it now has a green light to pursue its very aggressive activities all over the Middle East with renewed energy, with money, with very significant political immunity. So we have a lot to worry about in this agreement. That being said, however, I am not sure that there is a way back from this agreement by the United States of America. Because rejecting the deal right now would inevitably require America to double down on its energy and efforts in the Middle East. And this is happening when America is doing exactly the opposite. America is pivoting out of the Middle East. So to raise the stakes when you are unable to and unwilling, like this administration is, to put in more resources and more effort and more energy into the problem, it could be destructive. We may end up being without the sanctions and without the deal. What the President and Secretary Kerry did to all of us is they placed us in an all or nothing, take it or leave it situation. And now we're faced with saying yes or no to a very bad agreement. We didn't work with Kerry. We met with his team. When his team came in, when he started his effort to bring about Israeli and Palestinians to get an agreement, we met with them. I met with them. So we had a very candid conversation. Not so pleasant for all parties involved. And my question to them was, what were the lessons learned? What will you do now differently than you didn't do a few years ago? Because a few years ago, we tried to get an agreement, we failed, and that led to a war where there were 3,000 dead people on both sides. What have you learned and what's going to be different? And they had no answer to that question. And that was really unfortunate. I don't know enough about John Kerry to make a comment about him as Secretary of State, but what I can say is that on the one hand, we saw a lot of heart that he put in and a lot of effort in order to get the deal, but we also saw very little imagination, very limited manifestations of learning from past experiences and coming up with new ideas and innovative ideas about how to deal with the problems, and ultimately a huge opportunity that was missed. Because Secretary Kerry, with the amount of energy that he put into the process today, I believe that he and President Obama and Israelis and Palestinians could have been right now in a situation of a two-state reality, with a lot of outstanding issues, a lot of problems that need to be resolved. But the two-state reality could have been in place here and now. And that was a huge opportunity that was missed, and I'm not sure this opportunity is coming back anytime soon. I think Netanyahu understands, Prime Minister Netanyahu understands what many Israelis understand, that Israel and the Palestinian Authority are intertwined. And in the absence of the Palestinian Authority today in the West Bank, it would be Israel that would have to assume full administrative, economic, and political and diplomatic responsibility for the Palestinians in the West Bank. That would be a huge burden. And that's a burden that Israel cannot and should not want to carry. And therefore, up to a degree, Israel is dependent on the Palestinian Authority and vice versa, and Netanyahu is dependent on Abu Mazen and vice versa. And therefore, they should be able to speak to each other, and I'm very glad they do. So ISIS is obviously a player in the Middle East, and ISIS is a threat to Israel, but we have to understand also the dynamics here. The more ISIS consolidates and becomes state-like operation, the more it is vulnerable for Israel and for other nations as well. Part of when ISIS is an ideology that drives people, it's amorphous, it's intangible, it's also difficult to attack. But the moment ISIS has assets and buildings and vehicles and locations, it becomes more vulnerable. And one of the things we're seeing even right now with the targeted attacks of Americans and other forces in Syria and Iraq, there are increasingly successes, even though it's sort of a standoff kind of a confrontation. So in many ways, the fact that ISIS consolidates makes it a much more vulnerable target for Israel. This is in Syria and Iraq. With regard to Hamas in Gaza, there's the irony is that as radical as Hamas is, rejecting Israel's right to exist, there are groups that are further to the right of Hamas from the Palestinian perspective. And what is very important, a very important characteristics of Hamas from the perspective of Israel, is that Hamas wants to establish control and authority in Gaza. And therefore, it can be an address. And this is a very important feature of Hamas from the Israeli perspective, because the people to the right of Hamas don't want order, they don't want authority and control, they thrive in chaos, and in this situation, Israel has no address. So if you are an organized state, and on the other side there is chaos, you have no leverage. So in many ways, it is in Israel's interest that Hamas consolidates control over Gaza, that Hamas effectively fights all these radical groups, and then Israel can engage Hamas in this carrots and sticks process that we're seeing all the time. So in any way, ISIS is a shared enemy of Hamas and Israel. And if you read between the lines, Israel today is, even if you read between the lines, even the right-wing government of Israel today is learning to live with and coexist with Hamas in Gaza. The question of the future of Hamas and the PA is actually the question about the future of Israel. Because if there is no effective governing body on the Palestinian side, it would be Israel that would need to control the Palestinians, and eventually, long term, there will have to be equal rights between Jews and Arabs within that space, and the essence of the character of Israel would be lost. And therefore, long term, Israel, being the nation state of the Jewish people, has an interest in a functioning, governing body for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I think there is growing realization, even among leaders of the right wing, that ultimately we will have to coexist with a Palestinian entity in Gaza and the West Bank. Well, the issue of the settlers is obviously a big question, and ultimately an existential question for us. Because with the present spread of the settlements, we will not be able to disassociate ourselves with the Palestinians. And therefore, sooner or later, there will be a moment of big drama in Israel. Either we let go of some of the settlements and we consolidate our presence within a more limited geographic space, or ultimately we'll have to take responsibility for the West Bank, and there will be a scenario of one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, where the demographic makeup of this state is almost equal between Jews and Arabs, and that will create tremendous challenges of coexistence. So I believe that we are moving in the direction of the settlements becoming an existential issue for Israel that will require a very difficult decision by Israeli society. I would say that there is a solid majority in Israel that believes that we need to end the control over the Palestinian population. There's also a solid majority in Israel that is against taking the kind of security risks that are essential for ending the control over the Palestinian population. So these are two contradictory positions right now. People want to leave because they understand there are two contradictory positions. People want to end the control over the Palestinians because they understand it's dangerous, because they understand it's existentially dangerous in the long term, but they're not willing to do so because of the security risks. And that kind of dilemma, that kind of conundrum can only be resolved if and when there is leadership. The last elections, I think, reflected that confusion, very polarized the electorate between the left and the right. Eventually, Netanyahu was able to win by consolidating power within the right, but still a very polarized electorate. And what I hoped that would happen after the elections, which didn't happen, was that he would reach out across the aisle and build a coalition with the leaders of the center left. And I believe that this could have been an amazing coalition for the future of Israel. Well, the question about the longevity of government in Israel has statistical limits, I would say. No government ever served less than a year and a half. So I would say that's a minimum. Very few governments serve more than 3.5 years. So you're looking at between 1.5 and 3.5 years. Let's say we're looking at around 2 to 2.5 years. The point is, what keeps the Knesset in place is the fact that 40% of members of parliament, members of Knesset, do not get re-elected. And more than half of them are not sure that they will be re-elected. And therefore their appetite, having just been re-elected for another elections, is non-existent. So they will bend over backwards to allow the Knesset to continue to be in place. So at least a year, if not more, Netanyahu will be the Prime Minister of Israel. But I would say more 2 years. But I would say it is more likely that he will be in power for 2 years than 1 year. But the question is, what will Prime Minister Netanyahu and this government do with the power and the authority that they have? And that is the big question that we face. And there's so many issues here that are crucially important for our future. But most important, in my view, are the relationships with the Jewish community in North America and the relationship with the United States of America. Once the deal with Iran goes through and it becomes a done deal, then we need to repair the relationship between Israel and the Jewish community here and Israel and the American administration. The relationship between the State of Israel and diaspora Jews are far more complicated and far more nuanced and far more layered than just between the government of Israel and diaspora Jews. So there's a lot of work that can be done between the two societies. But I think that what is really challenging for us is to understand that Israel today is the 400-pound gorilla of the Jewish people. And we have to take responsibility. We as Israelis and Zionists, we have to take responsibility for the Jewish people. And we have to be true to our mission to be the nation state of the Jewish people. And in my view, being the nation state of the Jewish people doesn't mean that the Jewish people needs to serve Israel. It actually means that the state of Israel needs to serve the unity and the prosperity and the security of the Jewish people in Israel and outside of Israel. So I would like to see Israel being a force of unity for diaspora communities, a resource for their success and for their longevity. And that's where I think Israel should go. And I hope that this kind of relationship will emerge over the next few years. That's where we need to be. The statement by the Minister of Religious Affairs in the Netanyahu government that progressive Jews were not Jews was a totally inexcusable and unacceptable statement. And I would expect the Prime Minister of Israel to stand clearly and say that to the Jewish people. But beyond that, it is a statement that is contradictory to Jewish history. For centuries and centuries, there were always progressive Jews and conservative Jews. This is the story of Hanukkah. And we see that the people of Israel continues to exist in spite of the dramatic diversity of opinions. So in many ways, one of the secrets of our survival is the way we balance unity with adversity and diversity.
That's true.
And that statement reflected a deep misunderstanding of the secret of Jewish survival, security, prosperity, and leadership, which is our ability to be both unified and diverse. I think that Zionists and Israelis take for granted the political and financial support of diaspora Jews. And they take it for granted because they think that the role of the diaspora is to support Israel. But my perspective is that a vibrant diaspora is a Zionist imperative. It's not a Zionist compromise. And therefore, if we are serious, we in Israel, and therefore if we in Israel are serious about our responsibility for the Jewish people, then we have to be a force of unity for diaspora communities, to the extent that we can. I believe that Netanyahu, as the Prime Minister of Israel, has a unique historical perspective on the evolution of the Jewish people, and he has the capacity to repair the relationship with the United States, and he has the capacity to repair the relationship with this administration and with any administration that will be elected. There has been an issue that has been standing between the government of Israel and this administration, which is the issue of Iran. But within a few weeks, we may be in a totally different condition with regard to that issue if and when this agreement goes through. And I think that will be the moment when the Netanyahu government can turn a corner in its relationship with this American administration and hopefully use and leverage the environment that has been created around the deal with Iran and the way the deal with Iran has compromised key interests of Israel, to use that environment in order to create a new framework for the relationship between Israel and the United States of America that will actually enhance the national security of Israel deep into the future. And I really hope that this government will have the vision and the capability to make this happen.
Welcome to another Leon Charney report, and a very special report. We have with us Moshe Arens, who really needs no introduction, but I will introduce him in case you want to refresh your recollection. He was the defense minister of Israel, the ambassador of Israel to Washington. He's an MIT graduate, foreign minister. When the Scuds were taking place, he was the defense minister sitting in Washington, D.C., could be at the White House. We'll talk about it in 1 minute. And I was in his home in Savion filming the Leon Charney report, and I think he was being scudded at that time. In any case, it's great to bring him to the show, and we really need to hear from him what's going on in Israel, because it looks a little haphazard to the viewers, at least in the United States. Moshe, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be your guest again, not for the first time.
You remember that incident when, during the Gulf War, you're in Savion, you live in Savion.
Right,
Savion
right.
was being scudded as you were sitting in the White House, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, to be exact, it was being scudded in the sense that one scud fell in Savion and fell not far from my house. I won't forget it, my wife won't forget it.
And we have it on TV.
Yeah, on TV. And I did happen to be on a 24-hour visit to Washington, and I was sitting in Baker's office when they passed me a note saying that a scud had landed in Savion, and I had to excuse myself, go out and talk to my wife, and find out that she was okay.
Pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
Clear this up. I interviewed your Prime Minister, Shamir, many times, Yitzhak Shamir. And that was one of the biggest political moves, I think, in his career. When there was the war, the Gulf War, And the United States asked Israel not to reply to Iraq at that point.
Not to get involved.
Right.
Yes.
Eagleberger flew to meet you guys,
Eagleberger and Wolfowitz.
and they asked you not to do it. Was that a very tough decision for Shamir?
Well, I don't know that he had any
Choice?
But no, I wasn't going to say that. I don't know that there was any particular point where he made the decision not to do it. He dragged his feet. He was influenced by the calls from George Bush Sr., who was the president at the time. I think that he thought that he was building up a very good relationship with him that would stand him in good stead in the months and the years to come. And so I think his feeling was that it would not be good to cross him to do something that seemed to be so important to the President of the United States. But the war dragged on, and we were making our preparations for an operation. And then all of a sudden, as you remember, President Bush declared the ceasefire, and the show was over. And I suppose that maybe if Shamir had not dragged his feet and said to me, okay, go ahead, that we might have just gotten that last punch in before the war was over.
Well, you were defense minister.
Right.
Was it your call or his call?
Well, it's a government call. In other words, the way the procedure is in a case like that is I have to bring first to the Prime Minister, then to the government the operational plan and ask for their approval. Now, if the Prime Minister does not approve it, he's not likely to bring it to the government, and that would be the end of it.
What did you feel at that time? Was that correct decision?
I think the correct decision would have been for Israel to make a move.
Really?
Absolutely, no question about it. Look, we have never been hit without responding. That's not our style. You know, that may be Christian doctrine. You turn the other cheek. That's not Jewish doctrine. And we were being hit by Scuds. Not only the Scud near my home. We got about 39 Scuds on Israel during the 5 weeks of the war. And not only was it the principle of responding, as a principle that we've always stood by, and I hope continue to stand by, but also we were concerned that they were continuing to scud us, that possibly we might get some rockets with chemical warheads,
right.
and that we had to do everything in our power to protect the civilian population, to put a stop to it.
And the United States was against it because it would infuriate the other Arab countries, the coalition? Is that
Well, but Bush had very masterfully put together a grand coalition that included Arab countries, included Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and he did not want an impression to be created that this was a war in which Israel was involved or in which Israel was even starring. He wanted Israel to stay on the sidelines. He thought, although it's clear in retrospect that he was wrong on that the coalition might break up. We didn't want the coalition to break up either. And that could have aborted the whole operation against Saddam Hussein at the time. But we know today the coalition wouldn't have broken up, and by the time we would have carried out the operation, it was already after 3 weeks of bombing of Iraq. The operation was going very well. Nobody was going to pull out of that coalition, so it would have been okay. There wasn't really any risk there. And I flew to Washington the time that the Scud landed near my backyard, or almost my backyard, to tell the president that we were going to carry out an operation. He didn't like to hear it.
When the war commenced, though, I remember distinctly Eagleberger flying over to Israel to meet you guys.
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, Eagleberger came in before the war.
Right.
To tell us that the United States was going to launch an operation. And their concern at the time was that Israel would take some preemptive action.
That's the
even before the United States
right.
Began the operation. And that might screw everything up.
Right.
So he wanted a commitment from us that we would not take preemptive action. And he got that commitment from us. As a matter of fact, he got the commitment because in return he said, look, we know you're concerned about the Scuds, about being hit by Scuds. We will undertake during the first 24 hours, at most the first 48 hours, to neutralize the Scud threat. If we're not successful in doing it, we will stand aside and let you do what you think you have to do.
They thought Patriot missiles would help. They sent Patriot missiles
They
over?
sent Patriot missiles. They didn't help.
They didn't work at all.
They didn't work. I think at first they thought that the U.S. Air Force, I mean, they had a lot of air power out there, that they would bombard the areas of western Iraq where the Scuds were being launched from, and that they would be able to identify the launchers and knock out the launchers. Well, in the 5 weeks of bombardment, they didn't kill a single launcher, and the Scuds kept coming. So when 48 hours were up and the Scuds kept coming, I said to Charney, who was then Secretary of Defense, you said, if you don't do it in the first 48 hours, now it's our turn. Well, he said, I have to go back to the President. And then the President called Shamir. And he said, please don't do it. It could screw up the whole operation. And so we went from one day to the next. In the meantime, we were preparing for this action. A very good general was going to be in charge of the operation, Nehemiah Tamari. He was killed later on in a helicopter accident. And I remember like this day that I sat around with the Army people when they reviewed the operation with me. And before I gave the okay, I looked at Nehemiah and I said, how do you feel about this? After all, it was an operation about 1,000 kilometers from Israel. Not simple, you know, an airborne operation. And he said, I feel good about it. We're going to do it. I said, okay.
Fascinating history. George Bush gave Shamir a hard time after that. He froze the $10 billion. I remember
the loan guarantees.
The loan guarantees.
Well, you see, it just goes to show you, I mean, how relationships between countries can develop. Eagleburger then came for the second time. You know, as I told you, he came the first time to prevent a preemptive launch, preemptive attack by us. He came the second time when he thought that now we were going to do something. He told us, please don't do it. He came with Wolfowitz. And one of the terms that he used, he said to Shamir and he said to me, listen, you've accommodated the President of the United States. You now have a lot of money in the bank in Washington. Now, I told Shamir, this money is going to be devalued very quickly. And sure, no sooner that the Gulf operation was over and Shamir asked for the loan guarantees, the President said, you're not getting loan guarantees unless you dismantle settlement and unless you commit yourself to no further settlements in the West Bank. And so there was no money left in the bank.
I remember that time distinctly. And then Yitzhak Rabin became prime minister. I was in Kennebunkport when he went and met with Bush. Baker had said some nasty words at that time about Israel, which I can't repeat.
That was before.
And they were pretty tough. Although when I talked to Shamir, he had a great affinity for George Shultz. He always talked he loved George Shultz.
That was mutual, by the way. That was mutual. And I saw George Shultz just a few months ago. We were old friends. And I visited him in his office in San Francisco. And he recalled that he sat with Shamir, and he was trying to get him to agree to some diplomatic move. And he thought it wasn't going to be easy. So I said to Shamir, so what do you need in return? And he says, Shamir said to me, I don't need anything in return. I trust you, Mr. Schultz.
The Madrid conference, were you in the government at that time too?
Yes, I was defense minister.
Were you for it or against it?
I was for it.
I was out there with Shamir, and I think it was a big move on Shamir's part to go. No, wasn't it? It wasn't.
Yeah, it was a good thing. I mean, it wasn't earth-shaking and didn't really change things radically in the Middle East. But it was the first time in a long time that we had direct face-to-face contact with Syrian representatives, Jordanian representatives, so it was a good move all in all.
Made your friend, who you really made, Bibi Netanyahu, a media star too.
Well, don't forget, he was a media star when he was ambassador at the United Nations.
Most people don't know this, but Moshe Arens really picked Bibi Netanyahu out of, I don't know where he found him, but he really, in a sense, gave him his first start. It was at the embassy in Washington?
At the embassy in Washington.
When you were ambassador?
Right.
Did you know that he had star qualities in him then?
Not to the extent that became apparent later on, but I saw that he was a good operator, spoke perfect English, made contacts, got things moving, and I said, this is a good man to put into the embassy, and that was a good move.
What did he do at the embassy, by the way?
He was the number 2 man.
Do you know his father, too?
Sure, know him well.
He's a great scholar, his father?
Great scholar. I think he's 97 years old, but you can interview him. He's in great shape, physically and mentally.
We will. That's a good idea.
Okay.
He's written some great books, historical books.
He's written great historical books, and I saw him just the other day, and he said to me, have you read my latest book? I said, well, what is your latest book? He says, my latest book is The 5 Fathers of Zionism. I said, well, I haven't read it. I have to go out and...
Who are they?
He said to me, So, you know who the five fathers of Zionism were?
Birnbaum. Birnbaum was the first Zionist.
Well, he's not one of the five
But he was. Very few people know that.
Well, not by
He gave the name Zionism, by the way.
Well, not by Professor Netanyahu's accounting. So anyway, he put me to the test. You know, I felt like a schoolboy. This
Okay.
professor of history is asking me, so who are the five fathers of Zionism? Well, I said Theodor Herzl, right? That's an easy one.
Right.
Jabotinsky, that's an easy one, right?
Weitzman.
Max Nordau. Most people have probably even have heard of him, but
His street, they know. Nordau
okay.
Street.
So I got 3 out of 5, and they said, okay, who else? Who else?
Jabotinsky.
No, we have said it. Herzl, Jabotinsky, Max Nordau.
Right.
Well, now I see I'm getting a failing grade or barely passing.
Right.
He says to me, Pensker. Ah, Pensker. Yeah, Pensker wrote Auto Emancipation.
Right.
You ever read that book?
Yes.
Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5, I got stumped completely. I couldn't think of who number 5 would be. He said to me, Israel Zangwill.
Don't know.
Okay.
What did he do? Did you know about him?
Well, I know about him, yes. He was an early follower of Herzl's. He later became what was called a territorialist, in that he said it didn't have to be Palestine. Any place on the earth where we can get some territory for the Jewish people, that's where we should set up the Jewish state.
Wow. I'm going to cut for a break. We'll come right back with Moshe Arens. Last time we went to Moshe Arens, he had written a book. What was the name of your book, Moshe?
Broken Covenant.
Broken Covenant.
And who broke the covenant?
I'm sure you don't think it was Israel. Interview of the 92nd Street Y, and that time he wrote in his book to me, to a good friend of mine, Leon Charney. I'm sure we disagree on many points, so we'll check how many points. We may not disagree anymore, by the way. We'll be right back. We're back, our concluding segment with Moshe Arens, the former defense minister 3 times and foreign minister of Israel, and a very outspoken man, MIT graduate. You were born in America, weren't you?
I was born in Lithuania.
Lithuania. My mother too.
I grew up
Maybe we're related.
Oh, okay. Could be.
Can we get into each other's will now?
Well, okay, we have to check our DNAs and...
She was born in a town called Kalvria. I don't know where it is.
Oh yeah, no, it's in.
You do know?
In western Lithuania, yes.
I've been trying to find it, really.
Well, just get a good-sized map of Lithuania and you'll find it. Take out a magnifying glass and you'll find it.
Where were you born?
I was born in Kaunas, which in those days was the capital of Lithuania.
And your parents moved from that to where?
To America. Not from there, first to Latvia and from Latvia to America.
Your parents were Zionists?
Not really. They didn't go to Palestine, they came to America.
Which is Aza's definition. Weitzman's, I was at a dinner in Atlanta, Georgia, with Asa Weitzman, and it was a Zionist Organization of America, and he says it's an anachronism. I'm not going down to speak there. They can call themselves pro-Zionist. The Zionist is someone who lives in Israel. It's became a big issue with him. Is that your definition of a Zionist?
Well, I think that's something of an exaggeration. They're people who care about Israel, people who support Israel, they're Zionists. Now, some of them can make that personal move. Others find it difficult. Others have good reason why they can't do it. There are many people, different views on the matter.
Why did you go to Israel?
I felt that I should. I was under.
But you came from Lithuania to the United States?
I came from Latvia to the United States.
Latvia, United States. You lived in New York?
I grew up here. I served in the American Army. I went to college here. And
what rank?
I was a first sergeant.
And then you were educated at MIT, and then you moved to Israel?
Right.
Was there anything specific that said you should go there? Were your parents Zionistic in their outlook? I mean,
well,
what impelled you?
Just remember that I came from Latvia. Everybody I knew, my school friends, they were all killed in the Holocaust in Riga. Almost the entire Jewish community of Latvia was exterminated, probably the highest percentage of extermination anywhere. And if I didn't feel a certain sense of obligation to the Jewish people and the establishment of the Jewish state, I think there probably would have been something wrong with me.
Who brought you into politics?
Mr. Begin.
Menachem Begin.
Yeah.
He died a sorry man, didn't he? After the Lebanese War. Weitzman used to tell me that every prime minister went down ingloriously in Israeli history. No one went down sort of peacefully. Ben Gurion had a tough ending. Begin had a tough ending. Maybe Shamir came out okay. I don't know.
Well, Shamir's still with us.
Shamir's with.
Yeah,
No, but I'm
he's
talking
not
about
in good health.
I'm talking about his tenure as a prime minister.
No, his tenure was
Golda Meir
okay.
was a disaster.
I think the tenure of Eshkol was okay. He died in office.
I think he's an unsung hero of Israel. I think he was a great prime minister. I always say
and great
that.
defense minister. You know, we talked about civilians as defense minister. Great defense minister. Great man.
So,
And,
what year did you get to Israel?
1948.
And you fought in the War of Independence?
Well, I was a member of the Irgun. Yes.
You're going with the tough guys.
Right.
I said on this show 2 weeks ago, what two of the big decisions in Ben Gurion's life were the Alatal Lena, which I'm sure you would still be upset about today.
Still am.
The Alatal Lena was a boat that was carrying Irgun people in arms, right? And he gave the order, Begin gave the order to knock out the ship, and the guy...
Ben Gurion gave the order.
Ben Gurion, yeah, and Rabin is the guy who effectuated it. Is that still a cut? I mean, a bone in someone's throat in Israel? They're really.
Well, not most people, because kids that have grown up, most of them don't even know about it.
They don't know in Jewish history in Israel. They don't study it.
I mean, in the history books, not likely. No.
Really. And the second thing that Begin did was take reparations from Germany.
Ben Gurion did
Yeah,
that.
Ben Gurion.
did
Sorry,
that,
yeah.
Begin objected to it.
Yeah.
Yes.
What did you think at that time?
I was against it.
And if you could look back now, was it the wrong thing?
Look, I think that Ben Gurion's view was that Israel had to have it, that we needed that economic assistance, and therefore we should go for it. In retrospect, I think it's clear today that Israel could have lived without it.
Really?
Oh yeah. Well, look, Israel is an economic powerhouse, and it's grown throughout the years, and it's got stronger economically throughout the years, and it would have survived without the German reparations. So that argument that Israel just had to have it, I think really in retrospect we can see it's not valid. Now maybe it's easier to see it in retrospect and more difficult at the time. So the real question that remains is whether we should have taken reparations, what the Germans call Wiedergutmachung.
Yeah, to make good.
Repairing, making things good again, yeah?
Right.
Well, the Germans can never make things good again, you know that, and I don't have to tell you that.
Arik Sharon, was he a good prime minister?
I don't think so, no. And,
Was
and
he
the,
a
and the
real,
interesting,
he was not really a Likud person. I mean,
was not a
basically he
Likud- he was not a
started with
Likud
a
person, no.
party called Shalom Tzion, and then he sort of merged everybody together.
he started being a member of the Labour Party.
Right. I think the first chair that he sat on when he became prime minister was Ben Gurion's chair. I think
That may be.
he didn't run to Begin's chair.
Well, the interesting thing is you see that he had the aura of being a very good prime minister, and when he had the stroke, there was almost national mourning, although he was still alive, you know, but people realized that was his end of his political career, and there was no end of television programs about this great man and all he had done for Israel and prime minister, and the disengagement, which at the time was viewed as having been a very courageous and positive step. And now, a little over a year later,
Looks bad.
he doesn't look as if he had been a good prime minister.
Were you against the disengagement at that time?
Absolutely. Terrible thing, the disengagement.
Which is true. Today it's become a huge problem. They've never resettled the people, have they?
You know, I said in Israel that this could never have happened in the United States, that you pull 10,000 people out of their homes. It did happen once during World War II with the Japanese, and the United States has been sorry for it ever since and has apologized to the Japanese for doing it, and presumably at the time was also done in the national interest, you know, after Pearl Harbor and the danger of Japanese operations on the West Coast. Couldn't happen in any democratic country today that you pull 10,000 people out of their homes.
Well, I say the world's in trouble, and what happens basically in the mosque on Friday, whatever the clerics say to the population, is what's happening to the world today, which creates a sense of fundamentalism. And that fundamentalism, when you were defense minister, did you have many suicide bombings? This is a new phenomenon.
No, I didn't have any. I didn't have any. They came much later, but I have to tell you right away that we've been very successful in contending with that. We went through a terrible period. We had suicide bombings almost every day, sometimes more than once a day, and we brought that down and brought it down dramatically.
Yeah.
And I think people around the world who are intent on fighting terrorism come to Israel to learn how to do it.
Got to close on those words.
Okay.
It's really a pleasure to see you, Moshe, and you're welcome to this table anytime you're in town. His words are wise, and unfortunately, a lot of things he said have come true. And when he voted negatively, it looks like he was correct. We'll see you next week.